guys. I'm here to talk to you about the Abolitionist Movement, which was the growing movement in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s that was trying to abolish or stop slavery. This you can see is the logo that the Abolitionist Movement adopted. It would sometimes be put on tokens like you see that then would be disseminated on necklaces, or sometimes women got very involved in the Abolitionist Movement as they would do needlework and try to spread its message that way. Actually, a lot of the women that you'll hear about in the lecture today that got involved in the Seneca Falls Convention were also very involved in this abolitionist movement, this movement to stop slavery. One famous abolitionist is William Lloyd Garrison. He's a Quizlet term, so definitely make sure you know him. He was not a slave. He's a white guy, as you can see, very religious. He was considered a very radical abolitionist. Because he, in his newspaper called The Liberator, was very adamant about slavery needed to end immediately, not a gradual emancipation. And he believed that there should be no compensation for slave owners. Remember, slaves were very expensive, so that was deemed quite radical. Initially, Garrison actually got into the American Colonization Society, which was pushing for blacks to relocate to Africa, but then switched his tune and tried to spread his abolitionist message through his newspaper primarily. So that's how he made a name for himself, was by publishing his words and spreading that in the newspaper. Another abolitionist who had a very different way of trying to abolish slavery was Nat Turner. He was a slave, as you can see pictured here. He had visions of, he said he kind of a mystic, and said that he kind of thought it was his mission to kind of violently end slavery. And so the way that he does that is he hatches a plan and shares it with 5 other slaves, and they just go into his master's house while they were all sleeping and kills everyone in their sleep. And then they go to another house, killing everyone there, and so on and so forth. And eventually more slaves join. But eventually this rebellion is put down. They do finally capture Nat Turner, and he is sentenced to die by hanging. There's the tree that he died from. But this really scared people, because understandably so, now they're scared to go to bed, and it got portrayed very, very viciously in the newspapers, and people started to wonder, how could this have happened? And that's really actually what gave William Lloyd Garrison even more of a name, because people were wondering what is kind of sparking this. Obviously, Nat Turner had never read William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, but it definitely kind of this rebellion actually gave more of a name to William Lloyd Garrison, as people were wondering, how could these anti-slavery messages be spreading? In the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion, he was not able to obviously end slavery. He did kill about 55 whites, but in the aftermath, Virginia, in a very close vote, ended up cracking down even harder on slavery. And about 200 blacks were killed in the aftermath by white mobs and so forth. So that is another abolitionist, a very different tactic. The last abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, I personally would argue had the biggest impact on the abolitionist movement. So if there's one abolitionist that you're going to know, all 3 of these actually are Quizlet terms, but I would argue that Frederick Douglass played the biggest role. This is a much later picture of him, but he actually was a slave. And he did not try to violently end slavery like Nat Turner did, but instead he ran away. And then he used his own experience to tell people about slavery. He had taught himself how to read and write. He was a very educated slave, and he was able to share then his experience with the people. So he really convinces people, as they now, there's no TV, no internet back then. And so to hear his words, a firsthand account of just how bad slavery was, definitely changed a lot of people's minds and opened them up to how bad slavery was. He did also publish some pieces and so forth. He met Garrison. At first, Garrison was his mentor, and then later they diverged in their tactics and how best to eliminate slavery. But he was also very kind of forceful. A famous speech of his when he was asked to deliver on the 4th of July, saying that, hey, he called out the hypocrisy and saying, no, this is not an Independence Day for blacks. And he just kept pushing for slavery to end, and eventually does succeed in getting Abraham Lincoln to push for the 13th Amendment in the midst of the Civil War. So some Southerners have a very kind of change changed their tune as far as how they could justify slavery during this time as the abolitionist movement grew and it became more of a moral issue. Initially, some people justified slavery by saying that it was a necessary evil, like in the late 1700s, early 1800s. But now in the 1830s, 1840s, there's kind of a shift, especially led by John C. Calhoun, if you remember him, saying that slavery now is a positive good, trying to morally argue that actually it was good for slaves. And then interestingly enough, also the gag rule was implemented in Congress. This was prohibiting debates of slavery on the floor, showing how divided the country had gotten. And this was in effect in the 1830s, and then they couldn't stop slavery from being debated in Congress by 1844. So that's a little bit about the abolitionist movement. Hope that helps, guys.